Chapter 1. The Lost Daughter. The sound of distant explosions reverberated through the desolate wasteland that was once a thriving city. The sky above, heavy with dark clouds, seemed to press down on the battlefield, a grim reminder of the devastation that had ravaged the world. The horizon was barely visible, clouded by smoke and debris from the ongoing conflict. Everything seemed so lifeless here, as if the very planet itself had given up, worn down by years of endless war. The ground beneath her boots felt hard, cracked, and scarred, like the land had become as weary as the soldiers who fought upon it. Arya Quinn, now a seasoned soldier with the Galactic Resistance, stood motionless, her eyes scanning the broken landscape ahead. She had seen her fair share of war too much, in fact, but today felt different. The weight of the past, the weight of her lineage, hung over her like a shadow, reminding her that this was no ordinary fight. For Arya, this battlefield was not just a place where battles were fought, it was a place that had once been home, a place that held secrets about a family she had never known. Arya's mother, General Elizabeth Quinn, had been a legend, a commanding force within the Galactic Fleet, a woman whose name struck fear into the hearts of her enemies. She had been a towering figure, revered and respected for her intellect, her bravery, and her unyielding resolve to protect those under her command. But that had been 20 years ago, when Arya was just a child. Elizabeth had vanished, disappearing without a trace during a mission that had been kept secret from the public, leaving behind nothing but whispers of what might have happened. Some said she had been betrayed by her own people, others said she had been killed in the line of duty. Arya had grown up with only the stories of her mother, the fading images of her face in old holograms, the warm, lingering echoes of a mother she could barely remember. And so, as she stood here, on the edge of the very war her mother had once led, Arya couldn't help but wonder what had happened to her mother. Was she still alive? Was she out there, lost in the depths of space, fighting for something she didn't even know Arya was alive for? Or had the universe claimed her, just as it had claimed so many others? Arya's fingers tightened around the hilt of her weapon as she readied herself for another engagement, the thoughts of her mother distant but present in the back of her mind. Her hands, calloused and worn from years of holding weapons, had become as steady as the rest of her. Her mind, once filled with memories of a peaceful life, now focused only on survival. The Resistance had been her new family since the day she had enlisted, driven by the desire to fight the oppressive forces of the Galactic Dominion, the empire that had taken everything from her. And now, as she crouched behind the remnants of a fallen structure, she couldn't help but wonder if her mother had fought for the same thing. Had Elizabeth Quinn, too, stood on battlefields like this one, sacrificing everything for the greater good? Or had the Empire been her family, too? Arya didn't know. She didn't have the answers. She only had the present, the war that consumed her, the constant fight for survival against the Dominion and its ruthless forces. The sky above darkened further as Arya's comms system buzzed to life, pulling her out of her reverie. A voice crackled through the static, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Commander Quinn, we've got a situation. A heavy Dominion battalion is pushing through the southern sector. We need you to hold the line." Arya's jaw tightened. Another wave of enemy forces pushing in from the south. It wasn't unexpected, but the timing was not ideal. They had been fighting for days on end, no respite, no end in sight. But this wasn't a time to question orders. This was a time to act. With a quick nod to herself, Arya clicked her comms back on, her voice calm and focused. "Understood. I'll move in with my unit. Get ready for reinforcements." She didn't wait for a response. Her body moved almost instinctively, the battle instincts honed over years of combat kicking in. She sprinted toward her unit, her soldiers already moving into position. As she passed through the scattered remnants of fallen structures, memories of a time before the war, of a time before her mother's disappearance, flashed through her mind. The streets she had played in as a child, the laughter of her parents, the quiet moments shared at dinner with family, those were the memories that felt so distant now, almost like another lifetime. She had not chosen this life. It had chosen her. As she approached the command post, Arya's eyes locked onto her unit, a ragtag group of soldiers who had, over the years, become like family to her. They were tired, battle-worn, but their loyalty was unwavering. Each one had their own story, their own reasons for joining the fight, but together, they formed a bond that had held strong through countless battles. Arya didn't have time for pleasantries. There was no room for niceties in a war like this. Instead, she went straight into the briefing. "Listen up," she called out, her voice carrying over the noise of the battlefield. "We're not going to let them take this ground. We hold it, or we die trying. This isn't just about survival, it's about sending a message. We're not backing down." Her soldiers responded with a resounding cheer, their resolve hardening at her words. This was the heart of the resistance underdogs who fought for freedom against the tyranny of the Dominion. The battle ahead would be fierce, but they were ready. As Arya moved with her unit toward the front lines, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, that today would bring more than just a fight for survival. Something deeper, something that connected her past to the present, was waiting for her. The battlefield ahead seemed to echo with the promise of revelations, of answers she had been searching for her entire life. As Arya continued to advance, the smoke and haze of the battlefield clung to the air, suffocating any sense of peace that might have once existed here. It was ironic in a way. This world had been home to her before the war. Her mother's legacy had once lived here, a sanctuary. Now, it was a battlefield, nothing more than a shadow of what it had been. The soldiers in her unit, her brothers and sisters in arms, fought alongside her, but there was a distant look in their eyes, one that reflected years of fighting, years of surviving, but never truly living. Arya could feel it too. There was something about this fight that made her question whether they were fighting for the right reasons. Were they defending their homes? Or simply perpetuating a cycle of violence that had no end? Her unit had managed to secure a temporary victory against the Dominion forces on this front, but it felt hollow, empty, as if the war had already claimed everything important. Arya had become numb to it all, caught between the memories of a family she had lost and the responsibilities of the soldier she had become. She couldn't deny that the war had shaped her, had made her into the hardened fighter she was today. But somewhere deep down, there was a small piece of her that still clung to the girl she used to be, the girl who dreamed of finding her mother and, perhaps, understanding why the woman had vanished. As the remnants of her unit huddled near the edge of the battlefield, Arya's thoughts drifted back to the stories her mother had told her, the tales of her mother's valor, her legendary strength and leadership. General Elizabeth Quinn, a name that had once filled her with pride, now felt like a distant echo, a memory shrouded in mystery. Where was she? What had happened to her? The war had taken her father, and, it seemed, her mother too. And now, all Arya had was the inherited role of soldier and commander, fighting for an uncertain future, alone in a world that seemed to no longer care. It was that thought, that sense of loss, that propelled Arya forward as she joined the rest of her unit in the command center. The soldiers around her were patching up their wounds, preparing for the inevitable next wave of combat, but Arya's heart wasn't with them. It was still back in the stories of her mother, the only part of her mother she could cling to. She had heard the whispers, the rumors about her mother's disappearance. Some said she had been lost during a covert mission to infiltrate the heart of the Dominion. Others speculated she had been captured, tortured, or even betrayed. But none of those answers gave Arya the closure she sought. All she knew was that her mother was gone. And all Arya had left was her own battle, a fight she couldn't give up on, no matter how much it tore at her. Just as she was about to turn and speak with the other officers, a sudden explosion shook the ground beneath her feet, sending debris flying into the air. The sound was deafening, but Arya's instincts kicked in. She dropped to the ground, pulling a soldier close to shield him as the shockwave passed. The enemy had launched a counteroffensive, and it was clear that this wasn't going to be a simple skirmish. The ground shook violently again, followed by the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps. The Zyran Dominion's ground forces were advancing, bringing with them a new wave of assault tanks and mechs. The situation had just escalated. Arya's mind went into autopilot as she barked out orders, her soldiers immediately responding in kind. She had spent years training for this, learning how to fight, how to survive. But even now, amid the chaos, the question loomed: was she fighting for the right reasons? The fighting outside grew intense, but Arya's thoughts drifted once more to the memories of her mother. Where was she? Her mother, the woman she had admired from afar, would have known what to do. But Arya was left with only her own instincts, and they told her to fight. With the Zyran forces closing in, she picked up her weapon and led her unit into the fray, the sounds of war ringing in her ears. But as the battle unfolded around her, one thing was certain: Arya was no longer just her mother's daughter. She was her own woman, a leader in her own right. And whatever lay ahead, she would face it as one. Chapter 2. A Chance Encounter. Hours had passed since the battle began, and the scene before Arya was chaos incarnate. The air was thick with the stench of burning wreckage, the remnants of fallen enemies scattered across the landscape like forgotten pieces of a larger puzzle. The once bustling village now lay in ruins, its inhabitants either fighting or fleeing, its streets choked with the aftermath of war. Yet despite the devastation, Arya stood in the center of it all, her mind clear and focused. The resistance was still holding strong. They had repelled the first wave of Dominion forces and were now regrouping to fend off the next attack. But as Arya moved through the battlefield, her gaze kept flickering to the horizon, to the ominous shape of a massive warship rising slowly into view, blocking out the sun as it descended like some kind of mechanical leviathan. Her stomach dropped. The Dominion had called for reinforcements, and this time, the threat was far greater. "Commander Quinn, we've got a new enemy formation coming in hot," a voice called over her comms. The urgency in the message was enough to snap her back to the present. "On it," Arya replied, her voice steady but firm as she moved quickly to assess the situation. The new enemy formation was a mixture of mechs and armored assault vehicles, the kind that could easily crush the Resistance's defenses. Their technology was far superior to anything the Resistance had. If they didn't stop them here, the battle would be lost. "We need a counteroffensive strategy now," Arya shouted, rallying the troops. Her mind was working rapidly, weighing every option available. She could sense the looming threat that the Zyran forces posed, but this was different. This wasn't just another fight to survive, it was the beginning of something bigger. There was more at stake than ever before. But just as she was about to issue her next command, a loud, piercing sound echoed across the battlefield. It was a scream, primal and terrifying, coming from the depths of the wreckage. It was the sound of something being torn apart. Without hesitation, Arya turned to her soldiers. "Stay here and hold the line. I'll check it out." Her instincts told her that something wasn't right. The scream had been too human, too familiar. She sprinted through the war zone, her boots crunching over broken metal and charred earth. As she rounded a corner of the old command post, she saw something that made her blood freeze there. Amid the debris was a figure, a man, fighting off several Dominion soldiers. His face was obscured by a helmet, but the stature, the way he moved it was familiar. Arya didn't recognize him at first, but the way he fought, the movements, the power in his strikes, it was something she had seen before. "Get down," Arya shouted as she dove into the fray, firing her weapon at the nearest enemy soldier. The blast sent the enemy soldier sprawling, but it was the man's next move that caught her attention. With swift, practiced motions, he swung his weapon, knocking another enemy soldier to the ground with precision and skill. Arya's heart raced as she stepped forward, her pulse quickening. She needed to see his face, needed to know who this mysterious figure was. The battle around them raged on, but Arya and the man locked eyes for a brief, fleeting moment. In that instant, everything seemed to slow. Her heart stopped. There was a recognition there. The way his eyes, those eyes, looked at her with the same intensity she had only seen in her own reflection. It was him. "Father," Arya whispered, her voice shaking. The words barely left her lips before the world around them erupted into chaos once again, but this time, everything changed. The battlefield felt like it was closing in around Arya. The roar of gunfire, the explosive thud of grenades, and the shrill cries of battle mixed with the unmistakable thrum of recognition that pulsed in her chest. Her father. For a split second, everything around her ceased to exist: the war, the destruction, the soldiers screaming for orders. There was only the man in front of her, standing tall and resolute amidst the chaos. His figure was unmistakable, even beneath the helmet and armor. The stance, the movements, everything about him screamed a familiarity that Arya couldn't ignore. "Father," her voice was barely a whisper, lost in the deafening roar of the battle around them. She took a step forward, hesitating, as the man's head turned to face her. His eyes, hardened and battle-worn, met hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The recognition wasn't immediate, but there was something in the air between them, something that sparked with an intensity only family could carry. He didn't answer her at first. Instead, his eyes searched hers, as if confirming something he had always known, something that had been buried beneath years of war, uncertainty, and separation. He raised a hand, pulling off his helmet slowly. The action revealed his face weathered, scarred, and aged beyond what Arya had imagined, but unmistakably his. Arya. His voice was hoarse, cracked from years of silence and battle, but there was no mistaking the sense of recognition in it. The moment was too unreal. This wasn't just any soldier, it was the man who had been lost to her for 20 years, the man whose disappearance had haunted her childhood and shaped every choice she had made since. Captain Jack Quinn. The very name had once been nothing but stories and whispers. And now, standing before her, he was alive and fighting on the other side of the war. "I thought you were dead," Arya murmured, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to say more, ask so many questions, but they both knew that words could not bridge the gap of 2 decades lost. The recognition between them was powerful, but it was tainted by the reality of their circumstances. They were on opposite sides of a war, fighting different battles. And despite the overwhelming flood of emotions, Arya knew they couldn't afford to pause for too long. "We don't have time to talk." Jack's voice was firm as he glanced at the chaos unfolding around them. "We need to get to safety. I'll explain everything later." Arya nodded quickly, her mind still trying to process the whirlwind of emotions. Her father alive and here, in the heart of the battle. She had imagined this moment for years, but the reality was far more complicated than the fantasies of a child. She had spent so long searching for answers, only to find herself standing on opposite sides of a war. Before she could respond, an explosion rocked the ground beneath their feet, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. Both father and daughter instinctively dropped to the ground, their reflexes honed from years of battle. Arya could feel the heat of the explosion on her skin, the force of the blast reverberating through her bones. She glanced over at her father, his expression hardening as he scanned the surroundings. "This is bad, Arya. They're closing in. We need to move." Jack's voice was urgent, but there was no panic in it. Arya could see the same steely resolve in his eyes that she had heard in her mother's stories. Her father was a man who had been through hell, and it was clear that he would stop at nothing to protect her now that she was finally here, right in front of him. "We're not going anywhere, not without a fight," Arya replied, finding a strength she didn't realize she had. It wasn't just the anger at what had been lost, it was the determination to reclaim it, to reclaim everything that had been torn from her. She stood up, wiping the dust from her face and adjusting her weapon. She wasn't going to run. Her father gave her a knowing look, a small nod of approval. "Then we fight together." As they moved to the front lines, Arya felt the weight of the moment sink in deeper. The father she had lost was standing beside her, but the battlefield around them was unforgiving. The sound of incoming Zyran mechs and drone fighters echoed from above, and the earth shook with every impact. Despite the overwhelming odds, there was a part of Arya that felt a strange sense of peace. The world was still broken, but for this fleeting moment, she wasn't alone anymore. Together, father and daughter would face whatever the war threw at them. As they dove into action, their movements synchronized in a way that Arya didn't fully understand yet, a bond forged by blood, by fate. They fought side by side, Arya's mind sharp and focused, Jack's movements precise and calculated. They made their way to a safe zone, an abandoned outpost a few clicks away from the front line. Chapter 3. The Truth Revealed. The outpost was quiet, eerily so. The silence felt suffocating, broken only by the distant sounds of war. The walls were scorched, the remnants of old battles still visible in the cracks of the metal and concrete. As Arya and Jack entered, Arya couldn't help but glance at the walls, the dark corners of the room that had witnessed decades of conflict. The air felt heavy, laden with the residue of past lives lost, a haunting reminder of how far this war had come and how much had been sacrificed. "This is where we'll have to make our stand." Jack's voice cut through the silence as he took a seat, running a hand over his weathered face. His body language was the same as it always had been in battle calm, but tired. Arya could see the toll it had taken on him. He wasn't the man she remembered from the old stories. The man in front of her was battle-worn, hardened by years of surviving in a universe that had thrown everything at him. Arya, however, couldn't sit down. Her mind was still spinning, her heart racing. There was so much to ask, so much she needed to understand. How had he survived all these years? Why had he been fighting with the Dominion? "You're alive? I thought I'd never see you again," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "Why didn't you come for me? Why didn't you find me?" Jack's face tightened, a flicker of pain crossing his features. He stood and walked over to the console, pulling up a holographic map of the battlefield. He didn't look at her directly, but she could see the guilt in his stance, the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of his answer. "I never stopped looking for you, Arya." His voice was hoarse, raw with years of unspoken truths. "But when the Dominion took me, they changed me. They wiped my memory, forced me to fight for them. I was forced into their ranks. But every day, I fought to find a way back. To find you." Arya's breath caught in her chest. She had always thought her father had abandoned her, thought that he had given up on her just as her mother had. But hearing the pain in his voice now, the guilt in every word, made her realize the truth. He hadn't abandoned her at all. He had been lost, trapped in a nightmarish world of manipulation and war. How did you get out?" she asked, her voice almost pleading. Jack turned to face her, his expression one of both sorrow and resolve. "I escaped. Or rather, I was freed. The Resistance. They found me. I've been working with them ever since, trying to stop the Dominion, trying to make up for all the years I lost." Arya's heart swelled with emotion. Everything she had known, every story she had told herself about her mother's disappearance and her father's death, it was all wrong. They had both been fighting the same enemy, in their own ways, for the same goal. But the difference between their paths had been so great, so distorted by the years. As the silence stretched between them, Arya couldn't hold it back any longer. "I've been searching for answers all these years. I never thought I'd find you here, fighting for the enemy." Jack's eyes softened, and he stepped closer to her, his voice quiet but intense. "Arya, the enemy isn't always so clear. The Dominion, they took me, they used me, but I never stopped fighting for the cause. And now that I've found you, we fight together." The words hung in the air like a vow, one Arya wasn't sure she was ready to make. Fight together. They both had their own reasons for fighting, their own battles to win, but they would fight together now. And in that moment, Arya knew that everything had changed. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were family, bound by the shared weight of war and the unbreakable bond of blood. And no matter what came next, they would face it together. The weight of the conversation hung in the air, heavy with emotions that both father and daughter had bottled up for years. Arya stood there, her mind reeling as Jack's words sank in, the truth unfolding in front of her in a way that felt almost impossible to comprehend. Her father wasn't the villain she had believed him to be, but neither was he the hero she had imagined. He had been lost, a pawn in a war that had consumed him, forced to fight against everything he had once stood for. The man before her was both a stranger and someone she had known her entire life. "So what now?" Arya asked, her voice shaking slightly as she tried to make sense of it all. "You've been with the Resistance. Why didn't you come sooner? Why wait until now?" Jack's face grew tight again, his eyes briefly flickering with a mixture of regret and sadness. He looked away for a moment, the pain of the past clear in his expression. "I had to be sure, Arya. Sure that the Dominion wouldn't find you. Sure that I wasn't leading them straight to you. I had to gain their trust, even if it meant betraying everything I once believed in." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing, his voice more vulnerable now. "I couldn't risk you being caught in the crossfire. I couldn't risk losing you again." Arya's heart clenched as she absorbed the weight of his words. He had sacrificed everything, his loyalty, his dignity, and his integrity to protect her. The knowledge left her feeling torn. He had been fighting on the wrong side for so long, but his reasons now seemed so human. They both had lost so much, but their reunion, though painfully delayed, felt like the beginning of something new. Arya shook her head, her thoughts still muddled. "I don't know what to do with this, Dad. I've spent so long hating the Dominion, thinking they took everything from me, and now you're here, and I don't know if I should be angry or relieved." Jack reached out, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "It's okay to feel both, Arya. It's okay to feel conflicted. What we have in front of us isn't simple, but we have each other now, and that means something. Together, we can end this war. Together, we can make it right." His words felt like a lifeline. The war, the years of fighting, it all seemed so distant. The warrior instincts that had driven her to this point suddenly felt less important. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for something deeper, for a family she thought she had lost, for a future she wasn't sure she could have. As Arya turned her gaze toward the door, the distant sound of explosions in the distance reminded her that there was still a battle to be fought. The Zyran Dominion forces were closing in, their heavy artillery pounding away at the outskirts of their position. The war hadn't paused just because of their reunion. The fight was still happening, and Arya knew that time was running out. She had to act now, or everything they had fought for would be lost again. We need to move. The Dominion is on their way, Arya said, her voice sharper now, the soldier in her taking over once more. We can't afford to waste time. Jack nodded, his face hardening as the adrenaline of battle kicked in once more. Right? We're not just fighting for survival anymore. We're fighting for something bigger than us now, Arya. They shared a final look, one that said everything words couldn't. A father and daughter, united by the circumstances of war, standing on the edge of a world they could no longer afford to ignore. They exited the command center, joining the rest of the resistance fighters in preparation for the inevitable conflict. The air was thick with tension, the rumble of enemy tanks approaching becoming more pronounced. But Arya felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. Despite the weight of the world on their shoulders, despite the endless struggle they had faced, they were together. Chapter 4. The Final Stand. The final battle came swiftly. The Dominion forces, now with their reinforcements, had arrived in full force, their sheer numbers overwhelming the Resistance's defenses. The battlefield was a blur of action. Explosions lit up the night sky, the heavy thud of armored mechs pounding the earth as they advanced, and the harsh roar of laser fire cutting through the chaos. In the midst of it all, Arya and Jack fought side by side, their movements seamless, as if years of separation had done nothing to dull their connection. Together, they were unstoppable. On your left, Arya shouted, pulling Jack down as a volley of enemy fire streaked through the air, missing them by mere inches. Without a word, Jack spun around, his weapon cutting down two of the enemy soldiers with precision. They were both in their element now, the battlefield no longer a place of uncertainty, but a place where their combined strength could change the tide of the war. We've got this, Arya. Jack's voice was steady, but there was a fierce intensity behind his words. He had fought in so many wars, lost so much, but this moment fighting for his daughter, fighting for their future was the one thing that had kept him going. This was his redemption, and he would not fail her again. The ground beneath them shook as more tanks advanced, their heavy armor clanging against the earth. Arya's heart raced, but she was no longer afraid. This was her fight, a fight for her family, for her future, and for the freedom that her mother had fought for all those years ago. As she raised her weapon and fired at the approaching enemy, she felt something shift inside her, a surge of determination, of purpose. This battle was no longer about the resistance. It was about something more personal, something that transcended even the endless war they had been fighting. The Zyran Dominion forces were formidable, but the resistance had something they didn't, a reason to fight beyond survival. The battle raged on for hours, but Arya and her father held the line, their unbreakable bond giving them the strength they needed. The enemy fell back, their ranks crumbling as the resistance pushed forward with relentless fury. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the last of the Dominion forces were routed, their ships retreating into the darkness of space. The battlefield fell silent, the only sounds now the heavy breathing of exhausted soldiers and the distant crackling of fires that still burned in the wreckage. Arya stood at the edge of the battlefield, her chest heaving, her hands still trembling from the adrenaline. Jack stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, their bond stronger than ever. They had won, not just a battle, but their reunion, their fight to reclaim the family they thought they had lost. We did it, Arya, Jack said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Arya looked up at him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. No, we did it together. As the survivors of the battle began to gather, tending to the wounded and securing the area, Arya realized that this was just the beginning. The war wasn't over, but they had won something more important than any battle could ever give them, a chance at a future. In that moment, Arya knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together, father and daughter, soldiers and survivors standing side by side.